Hello everybody, this is Refresh and I am here to take a look at the Dovan Planeswalker deck for Magic the Gathering Ravnica Allegiance. This is for Dovan Architect of Law, and according to the back here, Dovan is a fastidious Vedalken engineer with a peerless ability to instantly spot imperfections in any system. Optimize your spells by casting them at the perfect moments and clear the way for your superior flying creatures to pummel your opponent. The contents include a deck box, a 60-card deck, play tabletop or online, so it includes a code to redeem your deck inside Magic Arena, which is a nice perk. And you also get two 15-card booster packs, as well as a strategy insert and two reference cards. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's inside. Alright, here is our shiny Dovan Architect of Law card. For 4, a white and a blue, you get a legendary Planeswalker Dovin, and he comes into the battlefield with 5 loyalty counters, and for +1 you get 2 life and draw a card. For -1 you tap target creature and it doesn't untap during his controller's next untap step, and for -9, tap all permanents target opponent controls. That player skips their next untap step. Here is our deck box with a very menacing Dovin reaching out for you. That's kind of scary, in blue-white colors. Inside we get our packs of Ravnica Allegiance. And here is our strategy insert. It says, hey, before you play, basically play a few games of the deck before you start updating it to know what the deck is supposed to do. But here is the playing deck. Dovan never starts a fight he can't win, a fact that his enemies tend to find out too late. Choose the ideal moments to cast your spells for maximum impact, whether you're disrupting your opponent's plans or furthering your own. While they struggle to build momentum, send your flying creatures to chip away at their life total until it runs out. I think this vaguely means that this is a tempo deck, but this is really vague on what you're supposed to do. What does it mean to disrupt your opponent's plans or further your own? Does it mean that you're drawing cards? Does it mean that you're countering your opponent's creatures? Or are you sending their creatures back to their hand? Like, what does this particularly mean? I understand that you're trying to win by flying creatures to chip away, but this is really vague and it doesn't really help you to understand what you're trying to do with this deck. It gives you terms to know, so it gives you a little bit of information about how some of these mechanics work, which is important because flying and vigilance won't appear with tip text because this is a expert set. And you also have a bit of information about addendum, which does have tips on the cards themselves. So it's a little bit, I suppose, unnecessary, but if these are the abilities that you're going to find on your cards, you might as well have a little bit of information there. Here's a little bit about Dovan Architect of Law. Through a combination of magic and expertise, Dovan can identify the flaws in any system or machine with a moment's observation. Though he believes nothing can be truly perfect, he strives to bring everything he touches as close to perfection as possible, a predilection that has made him an invaluable asset to the inventors of Kaladesh. To him, Ravnica is simply another flawed system. Now, I do like that it gives you a little bit of information about what his abilities are, but I kind of wish that there was a little bit more story as to what the heck he's doing on Ravnica besides just seeing it as another flawed system. You also have an ad here for MTG Arena, which is a pretty good way to play this game. On the back, you have a little bit of information about how to play Planeswalkers, which I think is important because you get a Planeswalker in this deck. And then an ad for Ravnica Allegiance Deck Builder's Toolkit, which replaces the ad for Portal that you saw in Guilds of Ravnica, which is probably a good thing because Portal never ended up becoming a thing. Let's go ahead and take a look at the deck itself. Alright, our rare is Unbreakable Formation. For 2 and a white, you get an instant. Creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. Addendum, if you cast this spell during your main phase, put a +1/+1 counter on each of those creatures and gain vigilance until end of turn. This is typically a card that you want to see in like a go-wide strategy as a finisher of sorts that lets you hit them hard and then have your creature survive to block just in case that you don't finish them off during that attack. Then you have Verity Circle. For 2 and a blue, you get an enchantment. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, if it isn't being declared as an attacker, you may draw a card. That's a really complex thing to put in one of these decks, but it basically means when your opponent's creatures become tapped and they're not attacking, you get to draw a card. It's potential to draw a lot of cards, and it gives you the ability to tap one of your opponent's creatures that doesn't have flying to draw cards as well. So that might be okay, especially if your deck has a way to tap a lot of your opponent's creatures. And then Dovin's Dismissal is the tutor for Dovin's deck that is unique to his deck. And what it does is, for 2, a blue, and a white, you get an instant that says put up to one target tapped creature on top of its owner's library. Then you get to get Dovin either from your deck or your graveyard. The fact that it has to be tapped does put a limitation on how useful this is. It means that your opponent does have to attack. Fortunately, it's an instant, so you can react to the tapping of a creature, but you either have to tap your opponent's creatures or they have to attack in order for you to be able to use this. Now, you don't have to trigger this ability. It says put up to one, so you can put 0 and just search for Dovin afterwards. So at least you don't have to wait for your opponent to tap a creature in order to use this. But that's not a bad effect, it's just not amazing. I do like that it sticks it on your opponent's library, so they're just going to draw that creature, and it reduces one of their draws as well. Alright, Dovin's common is Elite Arrestor. For 1 white mana, you get a creature human soldier that's a 0/3, and for 1 and a blue, you can tap it to tap target creature. So this is the way that you're going to do a lot of tapping down your opponent's creatures, and it's pretty much the way that you're going to keep your opponent from attacking or activating tap abilities if they have tap abilities. And it's going to interact well with Verity Circle here in particular, as well as Dobyns Dismissal. It's a pretty good common. Then we have Dobyns Automaton as the uncommon that's unique to this deck. For 4 mana, you get an artifact creature, Homunculus, that is a 3/3. And as long as you control a Dovin Planeswalker, Dobyns Automaton gets +2/+2 and has Vigilance. This is kind of a weak card. You'd think that it would be a flyer like a lot of the cards in this deck, or support flyers, or at least be a big ground body that just blocks all day, but it's not. It's actually a 3/3, and so it's kind of a hill giant with a bit of upside when you get Dovin out, but not a inspiring card that matches what I think the themes of this deck are. And then you get your 3 reference cards here. A little bit of information on formats, even though it might be a little confusing to players who just picked up this deck, as well as how to cast spells, attacking and blocking, and what to do on your turn, and then a link that you can use to learn more about how to play the game. On the back of this card is also going to be your code for your arena deck. I've already redeemed this deck, so don't bother trying to do so yourself, but it is a great thing to be able to buy this deck and then immediately be able to play it, even if you have nobody else to play against, because you can go on Arena and play it digitally. And that is the deck. I'm going to go ahead and play this a few times and let you know what I think when I get back. Alright, so I got to play with this deck a bit and I have some thoughts. The first thing to note is that this is kind of a flying tribal deck. There are 4 flying lords in this deck, the Windstorm Drakes and the Spirit of the Spires, which both pump flying creatures either on their power or their toughness. And to go with them, there are a significant number of flying creatures. And so I kind of like that there is this flyers sub-theme in this deck, and it works kind of well with the deck's other plan, which is to hamper your opponent and earn you tempo. So that is done in part with the Elite Arrestors, which are a way to lock down your most dangerous of your opponent's creatures at the cost of mana, and then eventually you'll just be flying over your opponent's creatures with your weaker but evasive flying creatures. There is some wonderful synergy between some of these cards as well that I appreciate. Your rare Verity Circle actually is a combo within itself because it can force your opponent's creatures to tap, and then that makes you draw cards, which is great. And then the Elite Arrestors also work with the Verity Circle to tap your opponent's creatures, which gets you cards and also slows down your opponent. Same with Code of Constraint. When you cast it on your main phase, it actually taps down your opponent's creatures as well, which can also get you cards from the Verity Circle. And so I like that synergy that's right there. In addition, you might want to use your Elite Arrestor's ability to tap your opponent's creatures as well in order to use Dobyns Dismissal, which is kind of weak because it has to be a tapped creature in order for it to work. Otherwise, it has no target and can't do anything. So I kind of wish that this said something besides just a tapped creature, because what if your opponent's creature has Vigilance? What if your opponent's creature is not going to attack and you need to get it off the board for whatever reason? So the limitation on this I find a bit annoying. I do think it's funny that you get put on your opponent's library, so it denies them a draw and sets them back, which I think a lot of this deck is trying to do. But there are some things in this deck that don't make as much sense. Now, I'm not going to say the Prowling Caracols don't make sense. Even though they're fragile, they can get us some aggressive damage early, and then they just become decent blockers because of their high power. What I don't quite understand in this deck is the Arrestor Zeals. You get 3 of them in this deck, and that just suggests that this is a very important thing for this deck to be trying to do, but the pump that it provides is very limited, and most of the creatures in your deck already have flying, so the fact that it gives your creatures flying by casting it on the main phase isn't that terribly useful. Now I understand that sometimes that means that you'll get one of your non-flying creatures a boost from your Windstorm Drake or your Spirit of the Spires, but generally this sort of ability is something that you want in a bit more of an aggressive deck, and this is not an aggressive deck by any stretch of the imagination. There's another miss that this deck makes that I don't quite understand, and that is, because the deck has so many creatures with high toughness, it's really a surprise that this deck doesn't include 1 to 2 copies of the enchantment High Alert, which causes your creatures to deal damage according to their toughness and not to their power, and that would make this deck quite impressive. But there's not even 1 copy in here to tease that ability, and I find that a bit of a disappointment. The last thing that I don't fully appreciate in this deck is Dobyns Automaton, which is the 3 of uncommon that's specific to this deck. It doesn't really serve the deck's general purpose in being terribly defensive on the ground. With it just being a 3/3, your Prowling Caracal can block something that has 3 toughness as well. And so what is it trying to do at 4 mana? It would have been better if this were a flyer, or if it played into the tapping theme that goes on here, but it's just a 3/3 that can become a 5/5 with Vigilance if you play Dovin. But even then, what is it really attempting to do? Is it a ground blocker? It doesn't fully make sense. And so that is a bit of a disappointment. Dovin himself is fine. You get life and you draw a card, which is fine. Drawing cards is good. And then tapping your opponent's creatures down plays well with this tap theme that exists in this deck. So I don't mind Dovin as much, but his Automaton is a bit of a disappointment considering how well much of the deck actually works together. Finally, there are 26 lands in this deck, and for a deck with a relatively low mana curve, Dovin is the only 6-drop, and there's a handful of 5-drops, yes, but that is not quite enough to justify the extra lands in this deck. So I'd probably remove 2 lands from this deck as one of the first things that I do to modify this deck, and maybe replace them with High Alerts, because again, that would be very good in this deck and it's sorely missing. Let me know what your thoughts about this deck were in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more such videos, hit subscribe. This was Refresh. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.